All right, so we've made it to Vatican II and the document on the liturgy. This is Sacrosanctum Concilium. So by this point in time, the liturgical movement's been around for about a century. They've been talking about reforming the liturgy to try to get more participation and to have people's lives be affected by the liturgy. So when you look at the reasons for this document, they're talking about the mystery of the liturgy and understanding the mystery of the liturgy in relation to the church's life and function. And so we read the document. It says that the specific ideas behind the individual parts and their connection with one another can be more clearly apparent. And so that it becomes easier for the people to take a proper and active part. So one of the things that was focused for both the liturgical movement and the reasons for the document was to have people enter into the liturgy and be affected by this liturgy. And it wanted to show the connection between the liturgy and the church in our daily lives. So it's trying to bring all this out in what we have. So when it talks about the celebration of the liturgy, they wanted to focus particular attention on the recovery of clerical concelebration, wanting to eliminate masses taking place simultaneously. But keep in mind, with all of the low masses taking place, many priests would always say mass, but you didn't say it with other priests, you said it yourself. And so you'd have sometimes 3 or 4 priests at the same time at the side altars saying mass. And so one of the things the council wanted to do was to show that it's the same mass and to have everyone that's celebrating at the same time celebrate it together. So they also wanted to emphasize the centrality of Sunday and the parish Eucharist, at which the parish priest should preside, proclaiming the Eucharistic prayer in a loud voice so that the congregation can be more spiritually engaged, and avoiding a lot of those repetitions that had entered in when the priest would repeat or say as well what the choir was saying. So, right, this is the time we talked about the liturgical movement. The ecumenical movement was also taking place. So it wasn't central in the focus of the liturgical reform, but they did want to make sure that the liturgy didn't hinder ecumenism. And we can see where that can kind of have some problems possibly. But of course, just secularly at this point in time, you have a large rise in the nationalistic spirit and the consciousness of nationalist languages. Think of the number of small languages that have been attempted to be saved, revived, etc. Or my language expresses who I am. And so there's also an urge or desire to bring my language and who I am to the liturgy. And so according to the document itself, the purpose, if you read Article 1, it reads, "The Sacred Council has set out to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful, to adapt more closely to the needs of our age those institutions which are subject to change," right? Not just any institution. "To foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ, to strengthen whatever can help to call all mankind into the church's fold. Accordingly, it sees particularly cogent reasons for undertaking the reform and promotion of the liturgy." And so we see in these senses, this is the very beginning of the document, setting out its reasons for writing this entire document. And it sums up the objectives that it's hoping to achieve in its publication. So what objectives is it setting out? It's actually setting out 4 objectives. So the vigor of the liturgy, the reform of the liturgy, the ecumenical nature, and its appeal to mankind. So we're trying to see how they apply then to the whole of the liturgy and the Church of Christ. So that's what we'll look at the document and what it says and how that's involved. So the document is actually passed. Did we all think that we needed liturgical reform? Well, it was promulgated on the 4th of December 1963, and the actual vote, so of the 2,151 people voting, 2,147 of them voted for the document, and 4 of them voted against. Clearly, the Council Fathers had a clear majority in passing this document. But there's also a balance of both tradition and progress. So it was actually the first document completed by the Council Fathers, and part of that was they figured it was a relatively easy one to pass. You can see how many had agreed by the numbers. And in passing it, it introduces, they wanted the mystical, the contemplative, that symbolic vision of the liturgy there. But they also enunciate the controlling principles that the Mother Church earnestly desires that all the faithful should be led to that full, conscious, and active participation in liturgical celebrations, which is demanded by the nature of the liturgy. So actuoso participatio, which we'll have to look a little bit at what active participation actually means. You don't want to do exercises? Jumping jacks! Let's go! Active participation! Yeah! Does not actually mean being active, like doing jumping jacks, although sometimes you can refer to the liturgy as Catholic gymnastics, you know, stand, sit, kneel, kneel, stand, sit, kneel, stand.
Salvanos, ten misericordia de nosotros y guárdanos, oh Dios, por tu gracia. Señor, ten piedad. Por Dios Cristo, Señor, ten piedad. Por la Madre.
But there also must be no innovations unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them. And care must be taken that any new forms adopted should in some way grow organically from the forms that already exist. So these are, one's paragraph 14, the other's from paragraph 23. But if you want to talk about what's the essential principles for how the church is thinking of reforming it, this is what you'll find. So in 1998, John Paul II had explained the meaning of the first principle. And he says, active participation, and we talked about, we need to think about this one, certainly means that in gesture, word, song, service, all the members of the community take part in the act of worship, which is anything but inert or passive. And yet, active participation does not preclude the active passivity of silence, stillness, or listening. Indeed, it actually demands it. So in a culture which neither favors nor fosters meditative quiet, the art of interior listening is learned only with difficulty. So here we see how the liturgy, though, must always be properly enculturated. So just because we have this, it doesn't necessarily make it easy, right? Because he says it must always be properly enculturated, but it also must be countercultural. We don't have that ease of active listening. We need to acquire that active listening. So just because our culture doesn't have it, we don't enculturate it and get rid of it in the liturgy. As for the second principle, the Constitution itself models the modesty it recommends, right? Various positive proposals are brought forward, yet there's a surprising absence of the very things that most people often associate with Vatican II, right? So if you think about what people argue come from Vatican II, a lot of it actually isn't mandated in the documents themselves. So we'll look at that a little bit as we actually go through the actual document.